Chapter 1. The Compulsion of Truth. There are few forces in the galaxy more dangerous than the unvarnished truth. In the grim darkness of the 31st millennium, the Imperium of man had learned to thrive upon necessary lies and noble deceptions. The Emperor's divinity was proclaimed while he sat upon the golden throne in mortal flesh. The Great Crusade was heralded as liberation, while worlds burned beneath imperial boots. Love between father and sons was assumed, while duty took precedence over affection. Yet even the master of mankind, architect of humanity's greatest triumph, could not have foreseen the moment when truth would become a weapon turned against his own heart. The celebrations had thundered through the imperial palace for 7 days. Word had reached Terra of the compliance of the Ultramar sector, that crown jewel of human achievement beyond the Sol system. Robut Gilliman had delivered not merely conquest, but something rarer still, a functioning civilization that could serve as a beacon for all the scattered worlds of humanity. The palace halls blazed with the light of 1,000 ceremonial fires, their flames casting long shadows that danced like spirits of triumph across walls adorned with the heraldry of 18 Space Marine legions. The Emperor walked among his court with the measured grace of one who bore the weight of species-wide destiny upon his shoulders. Custodians flanked him in burnished auramite, their guardian spears gleaming in the firelight. Yet for all the pageantry that surrounded the celebration, his thoughts dwelt not on the victories already won, but on the countless worlds that still awaited the light of imperial truth. Each compliant system represented millions of souls brought into the fold, but against the vast darkness of the galaxy, even Ultramar seemed little more than a single candle flame in an endless night. Malcador the Sigillite approached through the crowd of revelers, his ancient features grave despite the festive atmosphere. The regent bore in his withered hands a sealed container of midnight black ceramite, its surface etched with warning runes that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. Behind him walked a procession of tech adepts and astropathic scribes, their faces pale beneath their ceremonial hoods. "My lord," Malcador spoke, his voice cutting through the celebration's din with the authority of 10,000 years. "The expedition to Zerion 9 has returned. They bring something that demands your immediate attention." The Emperor's gaze fell upon the container, and for the briefest instant, his perfect features showed something that might have been concern. The psychic emanations radiating from the sealed artifact were subtle, yet unmistakable, a whisper of something ancient and malevolent that had waited in darkness for millennia. This was not the crude brutality of common demons, or the wild madness of unleashed warp energy. This was something far more insidious, a relic crafted with purpose and terrible intelligence. "From the deep vaults of a dead civilization," Malcador continued, his words careful and measured. "The expedition leader reports that the world's population vanished overnight, but their cities remained intact. This was found in their greatest temple, bound with psychic wards that crumbled the moment our forces approached. The container's surface seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a great heart beating in the depths of space. Around them, the celebration continued unaware, but the Emperor's enhanced senses could detect the artifact's influence beginning to spread like ripples in a still pond. Truth sense was awakening in those nearby, not the rough honesty of drunken revelry, but something far more dangerous, the compulsion to speak what lay deepest in the heart, regardless of consequence or wisdom. Within moments, the first manifestations began. A high-ranking administrator, moments before praising the efficiency of the Departamento Munitorum, suddenly declared his belief that half the bureaucracy served only to enrich themselves rather than the Imperium. A remembrancer poet, caught mid-verse about the glory of the Great Crusade, found herself reciting instead about the nightmares that haunted her dreams of burning worlds and screaming children. The changes were subtle at first, but the Emperor's psychic sight could perceive the artifact's influence spreading through the gathered crowd like a contagion of unwanted honesty. The Emperor raised one hand, and the celebration fell silent as 10,000 voices ceased their revelry in perfect unison. His eyes blazed with golden fire as he focused his immense will upon the sealed container, seeking to contain whatever malevolent force dwelt within. Yet even as his psychic might pressed against the artifact's influence, he felt its tendrils worming through his own mental defenses with disturbing ease. This was no crude assault upon his consciousness, but something far more subtle, a gradual erosion of the barriers between thought and speech that had been crafted by hands guided by intelligence older than human civilization. "The container will be taken to the deepest vaults," the Emperor commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Yet even as he spoke, he felt the first stirrings of the compulsion within his own mind. "It will be sealed behind wards of my own devising until we can determine its purpose and origin." But the artifact's influence had already begun its inexorable work. As the Emperor gazed upon the faces of his custodians, these perfect guardians who had served him with unwavering loyalty for centuries, unbidden truth rose in his throat like bile. They were not merely protectors, but symbols of his own inability to trust even his most beloved sons with the full weight of his presence. Each golden warrior represented a barrier between himself and those he claimed to love as family. The thought came unbidden, and with it came the terrible realization that the artifact's power was not merely forcing honesty upon those around it. It was compelling a deeper truth, the kind that dwelt in the spaces between conscious thought and careful word. The kind of truth that, once spoken, could never be unheard. The kind that could shatter the very foundations upon which an empire had been built. Malcador moved closer, his ancient eyes reflecting understanding and growing alarm. "My lord, if this artifact poses a threat to your ability to—" "It poses no threat," the Emperor interrupted. But even as he spoke the words, he felt their falsehood burning in his throat. Around them, the celebration had resumed, but with a different quality now. Conversations carried sharper edges as guests found themselves speaking thoughts they had intended to keep hidden. Laughter became forced as courtiers realized they could no longer maintain the careful facades that court life demanded. The container pulsed again, and the Emperor felt another wave of the compulsion wash over him. For one terrifying moment, he nearly spoke aloud about his true plans for humanity, the golden path that required the deaths of countless billions and the ascension of the species into something beyond mortality. He nearly revealed the weight of knowledge that crushed his soul each day, the burden of being the only one who could see the true scope of the galaxy's darkness and humanity's desperate need for evolution. Instead, he clenched his jaw and gestured for the container to be removed. Yet even as the custodians bore it away toward the palace's deepest vaults, he knew that the damage had already begun. The artifact's influence was not the crude psychic domination of a demon prince or the wild chaos of a warp storm. It was something far more insidious, a slow unraveling of the careful emotional architecture that allowed him to function as both father and emperor, both protector and conqueror. As the last of the celebration's echoes faded into the vast spaces of the imperial palace, the emperor found himself alone with Malcador in the shadow of the golden throne. The ancient regent's weathered features showed the concern that a lifetime of service had taught him to conceal from all others. "How long?" Malcador asked simply. The Emperor closed his eyes, feeling the artifact's influence settling into his consciousness like sediment in still water. He had resisted its immediate effects, but something deeper had changed. The careful barriers between his thoughts and his words were eroding, worn thin by psychic forces older and more subtle than any he had previously encountered. "I do not know," he admitted, and even that small confession felt like a defeat. For 10,000 years, he had been certainty incarnate, the living embodiment of humanity's will to survive and thrive among the stars. Yet now, he faced the terrifying prospect of becoming unable to maintain the careful silences that had allowed him to love his sons while using them as weapons of conquest. The truth was a burden he had carried alone since the Dark Age, when he first beheld the galaxy's true nature. Soon, if the artifact's influence could not be contained, that truth might pour forth like blood from an opened vein, and the first casualty would be the bonds of love and loyalty that held his family of demigods together. In the silence that followed, neither spoke of what they both knew, that the greatest empire in human history had just faced its first test, not from external enemies or internal rebellion, but from the simple, terrible power of absolute honesty. And that test had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Inevitable Question. 3 days had passed since the artifact's sealing, yet its influence lingered in the Emperor's mind like the taste of copper after battle. The deep vaults beneath the palace hummed with containment fields and psychic wards, but distance had not diminished the compulsion that gnawed at the barriers between thought and speech. Each conversation required constant vigilance, each word weighed against the terrible possibility of speaking truths that should remain buried in the depths of an immortal heart. The Strategium Imperialis blazed with the light of 1,000 data streams, hololithic displays showing the sprawling tapestry of the Great Crusade in all its terrible glory. Compliance reports flickered across vast screens, while star maps traced the advancing frontiers of human civilization. Yet for all the grandeur of imperial conquest, the chamber's true magnificence lay in the figures gathered around the central planning table. 16 of humanity's greatest champions, the gene-forged sons of the master of mankind. Horus Lupercal stood at the Emperor's right hand, his position as War Master evident in both bearing and the deference shown by his brothers. The first-found son wore the authority of supreme command like a perfectly fitted cloak, his every gesture radiating the confidence that had made him the Emperor's chosen instrument of conquest. Yet even Horus could not entirely mask the tension that had settled over the assembly like a shroud. The Ultramar triumph had shifted the delicate balance of responsibilities among the Primarchs, and that shift had bred resentment among those who measured their worth in conquered worlds and compliant populations. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors stood rigid beside his hololithic displays, his scarred features carved from stone as he presented siegework statistics with mechanical precision. Each number he recited carried the weight of a bitter grievance. Worlds taken not through glory, but through grinding attrition, victories measured in acceptable losses rather than celebrated triumphs. The Xerion campaign demonstrates clear tactical deficiencies in siege protocols, Perturabo declared, his voice carrying the flat tone of barely controlled anger. 3 systems could have been brought to compliance in half the time, with proper fortification assessment and systematic reduction of defensive positions. Guilliman, still bearing the laurels of Ultramar's integration, raised one eyebrow with diplomatic precision. "Brother, the cultural integration achieved through negotiated compliance, yields far greater long-term stability than simple conquest. The Ultramar worlds provide not merely tribute, but willing participation in imperial governance. Willing participation, Perturabo repeated, the words dripping with contempt. How easily the favored son speaks of willing participation when his campaigns are measured in months, while mine stretch across decades of thankless siege warfare. The temperature in the strategium seemed to drop several degrees as the assembled Primarchs recognized the dangerous edge in their brother's voice. Lionel Johnson's hand moved unconsciously toward his sword hilt, while Lehman Russ's fanged grin became something more predatory than amused. Even Sanguinius, whose presence normally brought calm to such gatherings, seemed unable to dispel the growing tension with his usual diplomatic grace. "Each campaign serves its purpose," Horus interjected, his War Master's authority carrying the weight of final judgment. "The Iron Warriors excel at reducing fortified positions that other legions cannot breach. That specialization serves the Crusades' greater needs, as does Guilliman's talent for cultural integration." "Specialization!" Angron snarled from his position at the table's far end, his scarred features twisted in perpetual rage. "A pretty word for being used as a weapon, while others receive the glory of statesmanship." The Emperor watched this exchange with growing horror as he felt the artifact's compulsion stirring in his consciousness like a sleeping serpent beginning to wake. Each barbed comment from his sons struck against his psychic defenses, threatening to unleash responses that would shatter the careful illusions upon which paternal authority rested. The truth was that he did have favorites among his gene-forged children, that some served purposes closer to his heart than others, that love and utility had become so intertwined in his ancient mind that separating them might prove impossible. The Crusades' needs dictate assignment of resources and responsibilities, the Emperor stated, his voice carrying the thunderous authority that had brought worlds to compliance through words alone. Yet even as he spoke, he felt the compulsion testing the boundaries of that statement, seeking cracks through which deeper truths might flow. Perturabo's dark eyes fixed upon his gene-father with an intensity that seemed to burn through the strategium's artificial light. "And what of our needs, Father? What of the sons who bleed and die in your name, while others reap the rewards of their sacrifice?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance shell, its implications clear to every soul present. This was no longer a discussion of tactical doctrine or strategic assignment. This was the fundamental grievance that lay at the heart of every bitter rivalry, every imagined slight, every moment when one Primarch felt diminished in the shadow of another's achievements. "Each of you serves according to your gifts," the Emperor replied, but his words felt hollow even to his own ears. The artifact's influence pressed against his consciousness like acid against armor, seeking to dissolve the careful barriers that allowed him to function as both father and commander. "Gifts," Perturabo repeated, his voice now carrying a dangerous softness that made several of his brothers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Is that what we are to you, Father? Collections of useful gifts to be deployed according to their tactical value?" The strategium fell silent, except for the soft humming of data displays and ventilation systems. Every Primarch present understood that their brother's question touched upon the deepest fear that haunted their engineered hearts, that they were tools first and sons second, that their father's love was conditional upon their utility to his grand design. The Emperor felt the compulsion rising in his throat like bile, threatening to spill forth truths that no father should ever speak aloud. He could feel the psychic pressure building behind his eyes, the artifact's influence demanding honesty regardless of consequence. In that moment, he realized with crystalline clarity that the careful lies of paternal love were about to be stripped away like flesh from bone. "You speak of gifts as if they diminish your worth," he began, fighting against the compulsion with every fragment of his vast will. "Yet each of you, which of us do you love most?" Perturabo's question cut through his words like a blade through silk, simple and direct, and utterly devastating in its implications. The silence that followed was absolute. 16 demigods held their breath as they awaited an answer that would reshape the foundations of their existence. Some had never dared to ask the question that haunted their dreams. Others had convinced themselves that the answer didn't matter. All of them, in that moment, understood that they were about to learn whether their father's love was the infinite force they had imagined or something far more limited and terrible in its specificity. The Emperor felt the artifact's compulsion seize control of his vocal cords like a puppeteer taking hold of strings. The barriers he had maintained for millennia crumbled beneath psychic forces older and more insidious than any demon's assault. Truth rose in his throat with the inevitability of a tidal wave, carrying with it the power to destroy everything he had built upon the foundation of necessary illusions. "I will rank you," he heard himself say, the words falling from his lips like drops of molten lead. "I will place each of you in order, according to the love you hold in my heart." The stratagium's silence deepened until it seemed to swallow sound itself. Perturabo's scarred features showed a mixture of triumph and horror as he realized what his bitter question had unleashed. Horus stepped forward as if to speak, then stopped as he recognized the terrible inevitability of what was about to unfold. "Father," Sanguinius whispered, his perfect features showing an anguish that seemed almost blasphemous on one so beautiful. "Please do not. The ranking will be complete and honest," the Emperor continued, his voice now carrying the inexorable weight of psychic compulsion. "Each of you will know precisely where you stand in the hierarchy of my affections." The assembled Primarchs stared at their father, with expressions ranging from anticipation to dread to something approaching terror. They had sought clarity about their place in his heart, but now faced the prospect of receiving an answer that might prove more devastating than any uncertainty. In the depths of the imperial palace, psychic wards strained against forces that had already achieved their purpose. The artifact's influence had found its target not in the destruction of the Emperor's mind, but in the unleashing of a truth that would shatter the bonds holding his family of demigods together. The ranking had been demanded, and the ranking would be given. The only question that remained was whether any of them would survive the honesty they had so foolishly requested. Chapter 3. The Burden of Ranking Angels. In the depths of the imperial palace, beyond even the reach of the custodian's golden vigil, the Emperor stood alone in the chambers that had witnessed the birth of gods. The sanctum where the Primarchs had been conceived stretched before him, in shadows deeper than the void between stars, its walls bearing the faint, psychic echoes of genetic marvels wrought in ages past. Here, surrounded by the silent machinery of creation, he faced a task that would have broken lesser minds: the quantification of love for beings who were simultaneously his greatest triumph and his most profound burden. Malcador had followed him into these sacred depths, the ancient regent's footsteps echoing with the weight of 10 millennia's worth of shared secrets. The sigillite's weathered features showed the strain of watching his oldest friend grapple with forces that defied even their combined wisdom. In all their years together, through the rise and fall of countless civilizations, they had never encountered a challenge quite like this. the complete erosion of the careful emotional barriers that allowed an immortal to function as both father and supreme commander. "You could refuse," Malcador said quietly, his voice barely disturbing the chamber's profound silence. "The compulsion is strong, but your will is stronger. You have resisted the whispers of gods older than human memory. Surely this artifact's influence can be overcome through sufficient effort and time." The Emperor turned from the genetic laboratories, where 18 miracles had taken form, his golden eyes reflecting depths of anguish that no mortal soul could fully comprehend. "The compulsion is not the problem, old friend. The problem is that I know the answer. I have always known the answer. The artifact merely strips away my ability to maintain the necessary lie." The truth was a weight that had pressed upon his consciousness since the moment each Primarch had drawn their first breath. They were not merely sons in the biological sense, though genetic material drawn from his own flesh had shaped their forms. They were aspects of his own nature given independent existence, fragments of his psyche crafted to serve specific functions in the great work of human salvation. Yet from those first moments of artificial life, something unexpected had occurred. Genuine affection had bloomed alongside calculated utility. "Horus!" The Emperor spoke the name like an incantation, and the chamber's shadows seemed to shift in response. "The first found, the first to call me father. I loved him because he was proof that my creations could exceed even my expectations. But I also loved him because he was mine when I had nothing else in the galaxy that could claim such devotion." The memories flowed unbidden, stirring psychic resonances that made the ancient machinery hum with sympathetic vibration. Horus as a child, eyes bright with hero worship and innocent trust. Horus as a young warrior, eager to prove himself worthy of his gene father's approval. Horus as war master, bearing the weight of supreme command with grace that filled his creator with pride beyond measure. Yet even those cherished recollections carried darker undertones, the gradual emergence of ambition that went beyond service, the subtle pride that crept into his beloved son's heart like poison in honey. "Sanguineous," the Emperor continued, and his voice carried a different quality now, something approaching reverence. "Perfect in ways that even I did not dare to dream. He represents everything I hoped humanity could become, everything noble and pure and eternally worthy of preservation. Yet I fear that very perfection, for how can anything so beautiful survive in a universe determined to corrupt all that it touches?" The angel's creation had been an act of supreme hope, an attempt to craft not merely a weapon, but a symbol of what humanity might achieve when freed from the limitations of mortal flesh. Yet perfection carried its own burdens, and the Emperor had watched with growing concern as his most beloved son struggled beneath the weight of expectations that no being, however exalted, should be forced to bear alone. "Magnus." And now the Emperor's voice carried pain so profound that even Malcador stepped back in unconscious response. "My greatest success, and my most terrible failure. He alone among them understands the true scope of what we face, the real cost of the path humanity must walk. Yet that understanding isolates him from his brothers and threatens to break his mind beneath burdens no single soul should carry. The memory of Magnus's creation burned like fire in the Emperor's consciousness. He had crafted his red sun to be a bridge between the material and immaterial realms, a being capable of wielding psychic forces that would have destroyed lesser minds. Yet in granting such power, he had also condemned Magnus to see the galaxy's true nature in all its terrifying complexity. The isolation that came with such knowledge was a cruelty that haunted the Emperor's dreams. "Each of them carries a fragment of what I am," he admitted to Malcador, the words torn from his throat by the artifact's inexorable compulsion toward honesty. "Guilliman bears my capacity for organization and systematic thought. Dawn embodies my dedication to duty above all personal desire. Vulcan reflects the compassion I feel for ordinary humanity. Corax represents my understanding of liberation's necessity. Yet in dividing myself among them, I created beings who could never be complete, who would always hunger for the missing pieces of their nature." The cruel mathematics of love and utility pressed down upon him like the weight of a collapsing star. How could he rank Angron, whose noble soul had been butchered by the butcher's nails, against Fulgrim, whose pursuit of perfection served as both inspiration and warning? How could he compare Mortarian's grim endurance against the Khan's joyous freedom? Each son served essential functions in the great work, yet each also carried pieces of his heart that could never be measured or weighed against one another. "The rankings will destroy them," Malcador observed, his ancient voice heavy with foreboding. "They are demigods, but they are also children seeking their father's love. To place them in order of affection will shatter bonds that have held for decades." "Yes," the Emperor replied simply, the single word carrying the weight of inevitable tragedy. Yet the compulsion grows stronger with each passing hour. I feel it burning away the barriers that allow me to function as both parent and strategist. Soon the truth will spill forth whether I will it or not. At least this way, I can control the manner of revelation. The psychic pressure from the distant artifact pulsed through the palace's foundations like a second heartbeat, each beat weakening his ability to maintain the careful emotional architecture that had allowed him to love his sons while using them as instruments of conquest. The compulsion was not crude force, but something far more insidious, a gradual erosion of the distinction between private thought and spoken word that would eventually strip away every careful deception upon which imperial authority rested. "Perturabo believes himself unloved because I assign him to siege warfare rather than glory campaigns," the Emperor mused, his voice carrying the weight of paternal regret. "Yet I trust him with the most crucial battles, the ones where failure would doom entire sectors. His bitterness blinds him to the fact that I rely upon his strength more than almost any other. But how can I explain that utility and love have become so intertwined in my ancient heart that I can no longer separate them? The truth was that each assignment, each responsibility given to his sons, reflected not merely strategic necessity, but emotional investment. He gave Horus the War Master's burden because he trusted him above all others. He sent Russ to execute the difficult commands because the Wolf King's loyalty was absolute and unquestioning. He relied upon Dawn for Terra's defense because the Praetorian's dedication matched his own. Yet in making such choices, he had inadvertently created hierarchies of trust and responsibility that his sons interpreted as hierarchies of love. "The ranking will reveal the false foundation upon which our family has been built," the Emperor said, moving toward the chamber's great viewing portal that looked out upon the workshops where godlings had been born. "They believe my love for them is paternal in the manner of mortal fathers. They do not understand that I love them as aspects of myself, as fragments of a fractured psyche given independent existence to serve humanity's salvation." The artifact's influence pressed against his consciousness once more, and he felt another barrier crumble beneath its inexorable pressure. Soon, very soon, the compulsion would become irresistible, The rankings would be spoken, the hierarchy made manifest, and the careful illusions that allowed 18 demigods to function as brothers would be shattered beyond any hope of repair. "I will begin with the lowest," he decided, the words falling from his lips with the finality of a death sentence. Perhaps mercy lies in allowing the least beloved to understand their position before the revelation of those who hold greater places in my heart compounds their anguish. Malcador said nothing, for what words could possibly suffice in the face of such inevitable tragedy? Instead, he simply stood, witness as the master of mankind prepared to destroy the bonds of love that held his greatest creation together, not through malice or cruelty, but through the simple, terrible power of absolute honesty. In the depths of the imperial palace, surrounded by the machinery that had birthed gods, the emperor began the grim work of quantifying the unquantifiable. The rankings took shape in his mind like a funeral procession, each name carrying the weight of dreams fulfilled and dreams forever broken. The burden of loving angels, he realized, was that even divine affection must eventually be measured against the cruel mathematics of survival and necessity. Chapter 4. The Methodology of Impossible Love. The emperor stood before a vast hololithic display that filled the chamber's curved wall with the images of his 18 sons, each rendered in perfect detail, down to the scars that marked their gene-forged flesh. The faces of demigods gazed back at him, with expressions captured in moments of triumph, contemplation, and grim determination. Yet for all their divine perfection, they remained his children, and the task of ranking them according to love seemed no less impossible than measuring the relative brightness of stars or weighing the depths of oceans. "There must be criteria," he spoke aloud, his voice echoing in the chamber's vast emptiness. "Some framework through which the chaos of emotion can be given order and meaning." Malcador remained silent, understanding that his oldest friend was not seeking counsel, but rather speaking thoughts that demanded voice to maintain their clarity. The artifact's influence pressed against both their minds now, its compulsion growing stronger with each passing hour. Soon, the emperor would be unable to resist its demand for absolute honesty, and when that moment came, the ranking must be complete and ready to destroy everything they had built together. The emperor raised one hand, and the hololithic display shifted to show 3 intersecting spheres of light, each representing a different aspect of the relationship between creator and created. "Loyalty," he said, and the first sphere blazed with golden radiance. Not mere obedience, but the deeper commitment that transcends circumstance and convenience. The willingness to stand by my side, even when the path leads through darkness. Horus's image moved to occupy the center of the first sphere, his noble features reflecting the unwavering devotion that had earned him the title of War Master. Yet even as the emperor gazed upon his first found son, darker currents stirred in his ancient consciousness. Loyalty given freely was precious beyond measure, but loyalty that expected reward or recognition carried within it the seeds of eventual betrayal. Horus loved him, but Horus also expected that love to be returned in equal measure, and such expectations created vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. "Competence," the emperor continued, and the second sphere ignited with silver fire. The ability to achieve objectives, regardless of obstacles or opposition. The practical wisdom that transforms vision into reality. Guilliman's image joined the display, his steady gaze reflecting the systematic intelligence that had built Ultramar into a shining example of imperial excellence. The master of the 13th Legion possessed a rare gift for translating grand designs into functional reality, for taking the emperor's vast ambitions and breaking them down into achievable components. Yet competence without passion was merely efficient condemned, and the emperor found himself wondering whether his son's devotion stemmed from genuine affection or simply recognition of superior strategic vision. "Emotional connection," he said finally, and the third sphere blazed with light that shifted between gold and crimson. The indefinable bond that transcends logic and utility, the simple fact that some souls resonate more deeply with one's own nature than others. Sanguinius materialized within the third sphere, his perfect features unmarred by the cynicism that had begun to touch so many of his brothers. The angel represented everything the emperor had hoped humanity might become: noble, compassionate, beautiful in ways that transcended mere physical form. Yet that very perfection created its own burden. For how could any being, however exalted, maintain such purity in a universe determined to corrupt all that it touched? The mathematics prove insufficient, the emperor admitted, watching as the three spheres rotated around each other in complex orbital patterns. Each criterion intersects with the others in ways that defy simple measurement. Dawn's loyalty is absolute, but his emotional distance limits the connection between us. Magnus's psychic bond transcends anything the others can achieve, yet his competence is compromised by intellectual pride. Vulcan's compassion creates profound emotional resonance, but his gentle nature sometimes limits his tactical effectiveness. The hololithic display shifted again, showing each Primarch positioned according to their relative strength in each category. The results created a complex, three-dimensional map of relationships that defied any attempt to establish clear hierarchies. Russ scored highest in loyalty, but lower in intellectual competence. The Lion's tactical brilliance was offset by emotional barriers that even a father's love struggled to penetrate. Ferrus Manus's dedication to perfection created both profound competence and troubling emotional distance. Angron presents the cruelest paradox, the emperor mused, his voice carrying the weight of paternal anguish. Beneath the rage and the neural damage lies a soul of such nobility that it breaks my heart to witness its suffering. Yet the butcher's nails have made him nearly unusable as anything but a weapon of last resort. How do I rank a son whose potential greatness has been forever compromised by circumstances beyond his control? The gladiator Primarch's image flickered between positions on the display, his scarred features bearing witness to torments that no amount of love could heal. The emperor had found him too late to prevent the installation of the archaeotech that had turned a noble warrior into an engine of perpetual fury. Yet beneath that manufactured rage burned a spirit that commanded respect and, yes, a form of love that transcended utility or strategic value. Mortarion and Kurz represent different forms of necessary darkness, he continued, manipulating the display to show the Death Guard and Night Lord's Primarchs side by side. Both understand aspects of warfare that their more noble brothers cannot grasp. Both serve functions essential to the Crusade's success. Yet their methods create distance between us that grows wider with each passing campaign. The pale figure of the Death Lord stood in stark contrast to the shadow-wreathed form of the Night Haunter, yet both carried within them the capacity for horrors that even the Emperor sometimes found difficult to witness. They were necessary tools in humanity's survival, but tools that came with costs that extended beyond mere strategic calculation. Loving them required accepting the darkness they brought to his cause, and such acceptance carried its own burden of complicity. The Khan represents freedom in its purest form, the Emperor reflected, watching as Jagatai's image seemed to move even in hololithic stillness. His joy in speed and independence reminds me of what we fight to preserve. Yet that same independence creates barriers that limit the depth of our connection. He serves the crusade magnificently, but he serves it on his own terms, and those terms sometimes place him beyond my reach. The White Scars. Primarch had always been something of an enigma, loyal to the imperial cause, but resistant to the rigid structures that governed most Legion operations. His competence was undeniable, his loyalty unquestioned, yet the emotional connection remained elusive, not absent, but filtered through layers of cultural difference and philosophical independence that made true intimacy difficult to achieve. Perturabo's bitterness blinds him to the trust I place in his abilities, the Emperor said, studying his fourth son's image with something approaching regret. I assign him to siege warfare, not as punishment, but because he excels at breaking what others cannot. Yet he interprets utilization as evidence of diminished affection, creating a spiral of resentment that damages both his effectiveness and our relationship. The Iron Warriors. Primarch stood rigid in his hololithic representation, his scarred features reflecting the accumulated grievances of decades spent in thankless campaigns. The Emperor could see the boy who had once looked upon him with such hope and wonder. But that child had been buried beneath layers of perceived neglect and professional disappointment. Loving Perturabo had become an exercise in reaching across an ever-widening chasm of mutual misunderstanding. Fulgrim pursues perfection with an intensity that both inspires and concerns, he noted, watching as the Phoenix Primarch's image seemed to shimmer with barely contained ambition. His dedication to excellence serves as an example to all the legions, yet I fear that his pursuit of idealized achievement may lead him down paths that compromise the very values he seeks to embody. The Emperor's children. Primarch represented the dangerous seduction of absolute standards, the belief that perfection could be achieved through sufficiently focused effort and will. Such dedication produced remarkable results, but it also created vulnerabilities to influences that promised shortcuts to transcendence. The Emperor loved Fulgrim's ambition while fearing its ultimate destination. Alpha Legion remains the greatest cipher, he admitted, studying the twins who shared command of the 20th Legion. Their methods serve imperial objectives with ruthless efficiency, yet their secrecy creates barriers that even I struggle to penetrate. They are loyal to the cause, but whether they are loyal to me personally remains an open question. Alpharius and Omegan stood as shadowed figures in the display, their faces obscured by the same mysteries that shrouded their legion's operations. They were effective beyond question, their competence in matters of intelligence and infiltration unmatched by any other force at his disposal. Yet the emotional connection remained frustratingly incomplete, filtered through layers of operational security that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. The ranking must account for all these variables, while acknowledging that love cannot be reduced to mere arithmetic, the Emperor concluded, watching as the hololithic display began to arrange his sons in a preliminary hierarchy. Yet the compulsion demands precision, demands that I speak numbers where only feelings should exist. The first draft of the ranking materialized in the chamber's artificial light, each name carrying the weight of dreams fulfilled and dreams broken. The Emperor stared at the list with growing horror, understanding that the moment it was spoken aloud, the bonds that held his family together would be shattered beyond any hope of repair. Yet the artifact's influence left him no choice. The ranking would be given, the hierarchy made manifest, and 18 demigods would learn exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of their father's affections. The mathematics of impossible love had been calculated, and the results would damn them all. Chapter 5. The announcement approaches. Word spread through the imperial palace like fire through dry parchment, carried on whispers that echoed through corridors built to house gods. Servants spoke in hushed tones of the emperor's withdrawal to his private chambers, of conferences with the sigillite that stretched through the night hours, of preparations for a gathering that would reshape the foundations of the Great Crusade itself. Yet for all their speculation, none among the mortal population of Terra could truly grasp the magnitude of what approached, the systematic destruction of bonds that had held 18 demigods together as brothers. The Primarchs themselves felt the tremors of approaching catastrophe through psychic resonances that transcended mere rumor. Each possessed senses refined beyond mortal comprehension, and all detected the subtle shifts in their gene-fathers' psychic emanations that spoke of decisions made and consequences accepted. What had begun as strategic disagreement in the strategium had metastasized into something far more dangerous, a crisis that would test every assumption upon which their fraternal bonds were built. Robert Guilliman paced the length of his temporary quarters with mechanical precision, his analytical mind racing to find solutions to a problem that defied logical resolution. The Master of Ultramar had spent decades building consensus among diverse populations, creating unity from chaos through careful diplomacy and systematic governance. Yet the challenge now facing his family seemed to resist every tool in his considerable arsenal of political wisdom. There must be a way to prevent this madness, he spoke to the empty chamber, his voice carrying the frustration of a mind accustomed to solving complex problems through methodical analysis. Rankings imply hierarchy, and hierarchy among brothers can only breed resentment and division. Yet even as he sought solutions, Guilliman found his thoughts drifting toward darker considerations. If the Emperor truly intended to rank his sons according to love, where might the Master of the 13th Legion find himself positioned? His achievements in Ultramar were undeniable, his strategic competence proven across 100 campaigns. But competence and affection were not identical qualities, and the distinction had begun to haunt his normally confident thoughts. 3 levels below, in chambers that reeked of blood and chain-axe lubricant, Angron received the news with a reaction that surprised even his closest warriors. The Primarch of the World Eaters did not rage or bellow or demand immediate satisfaction through violence. Instead, he laughed, a sound devoid of humor that carried within it the accumulated bitterness of decades spent as the Emperor's attack dog. "So the old man will finally speak the truth," Angron growled to his equerry, scarred features twisting into something that might have been a smile on a more rational face. "No more pretending that we are all equally beloved sons. No more careful words that say nothing while meaning everything. Just the raw honesty of which son he would save if the ship were sinking and he could only choose one." The butcher's nails pulsed in Angron's skull, their neural interfaces singing with anticipation of the violence that must surely follow such revelations. He had always known himself to be among the least favored of the Emperor's children, his methods too brutal, his damaged mind too unreliable for anything but the crudest applications of force. Yet there was liberation in having such knowledge confirmed, rather than living with the false hope that love might overcome utility. In the uppermost spires of the palace, where crystalline walls caught and refracted the light of Terra's dying sun, Fulgrim studied his reflection in mirrors polished to impossible perfection. The Phoenix Primarch had always understood himself to be exceptional among exceptional beings, crafted with aesthetic sensibilities and pursuit of excellence that set him apart from his more brutally functional brothers. Surely such refinement would earn recognition in any honest assessment of paternal affection. "The ranking will vindicate everything we have achieved," he murmured to his reflection, adjusting the fall of his perfect hair with movements that bordered on ritual. "Father will see that true greatness lies not in mere conquest, but in the pursuit of idealized perfection. The Emperor's children have always represented the highest aspirations of his vision for humanity." Yet beneath the confident words, doubt gnawed like acid at the edges of Fulgrim's self-assurance. What if the Emperor valued pragmatic competence over aesthetic achievement? What if the rankings reflected strategic utility rather than personal admiration? The possibility of discovering himself ranked below brothers he considered intellectually and culturally inferior had begun to poison even his most basic assumptions about his place in the imperial hierarchy. Magnus the Red stood alone in his meditation chambers, reaching out through psychic channels that spanned the galaxy in search of his gene father's consciousness. The Crimson King possessed empathic abilities that transcended normal communication, psychic gifts that had always allowed him to sense the Emperor's thoughts and intentions with clarity that his brothers envied. Yet now those same channels seemed blocked by barriers that resisted even his most focused efforts at penetration. "Father," he whispered into the psychic void, his voice carrying across dimensions that existed between the material realm and the warp's chaotic depths. "Do not allow this compulsion to destroy what we have built together. The bonds between us are stronger than any artifact's influence." No response came through the Empyrean silence, only the distant echo of psychic forces that felt alien and malevolent in their patient persistence. Magnus could sense the artifact's influence like a cancer eating at his gene father's mental defenses, could feel the inexorable pressure that would soon make honesty unavoidable. The Thousand Sons, Primarch, understood better than any of his brothers the true scope of what approached, not mere embarrassment or wounded pride, but the complete restructuring of family bonds according to mathematical principles that love was never meant to endure. Deep in the palace's forges, where the heat of creation blazed eternal, Vulcan worked metal with hands that had crafted weapons for gods, while his mind wrestled with problems that no amount of technical skill could solve. The gentle giant among the Primarchs had always served as mediator when tensions arose between his brothers, his patient wisdom and genuine compassion making him a natural choice for diplomatic intervention. Yet the crisis now approaching seemed to resist every attempt at peaceful resolution. "Perhaps if we spoke to him together," Vulcan mused to the apprentice smiths who worked alongside him, his voice carrying the measured cadence of one accustomed to teaching through example. Surely the combined voices of his sons would carry more weight than individual protests. Yet even as he spoke the words, Vulcan recognized their futility. The Emperor had never been swayed by emotional appeals when strategic necessity demanded action, and the artifact's compulsion seemed to have moved beyond the reach of mere persuasion. Whatever force drove their gene father toward this devastating honesty operated according to principles that transcended family loyalty or paternal wisdom. Lionel Johnson maintained his vigil in chambers decorated with the heraldry of ancient Caliban, his noble features betraying nothing of the turmoil that raged beneath their composed surface. The First Legion's Primarch had always struggled with the emotional complexities of brotherhood, his instincts shaped by years of solitary survival in forests where trust was a luxury few could afford. Yet for all his emotional distance, the lion possessed pride enough to power a star's fusion, and that pride now warred with fears he could barely acknowledge. "I am the first," he reminded himself, the words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The prototype from which all others were derived. Surely that grants some measure of precedence in any honest assessment of worth and affection. Yet doubts crept through even the lion's formidable mental defenses, like shadows through a forest at twilight. The Emperor had never shown particular favoritism toward the First Legion, despite their historical precedents. Other brothers had received War Master appointments, special honors, crucial assignments that seemed to reflect greater trust and confidence. Perhaps being first meant nothing more than being the rough draft for more refined creations. Throughout the palace, similar conversations unfolded as 16 demigods grappled with questions that had always lurked beneath the surface of their fraternal relationships. Rogel Dawn retreated into stoic silence, his fortress mind locking away fears that threatened to undermine the absolute dedication that defined his existence. Leman Russ prowled his chambers like a caged wolf, alternating between loyalty to his gene father and protective instincts toward brothers who might soon be wounded beyond healing. Korax withdrew into shadows that matched his legion's methods, his analytical mind cataloguing every slight and favor that might influence the coming rankings. Conrad Kurz laughed at the approaching chaos with the bitter humor of one who had always known that family bonds were illusions painted over deeper truths about power and utility. Mortarion embraced the coming revelation with the grim satisfaction of one who preferred harsh honesty to comfortable lies. The Alpha Legion twins remained mysteriously absent from the palace's growing tensions, their whereabouts unknown even to their closest allies. Yet their absence spoke volumes about the crisis that approached. Even the masters of intelligence and infiltration had found no way to prevent the coming catastrophe through their usual methods of manipulation and misdirection. As night fell over Terra's ancient surface, the Imperial Palace hummed with nervous energy that set every psychic sensitive on edge. Preparations had begun for a gathering that would bring all available Primarchs together in the throne room, where their gene father would speak truths that had been hidden since their creation. None could predict exactly how the rankings would unfold, but all understood that the bonds holding their family together would not survive the revelation unchanged. In the darkness between sunset and dawn, 18 sons of the Master of Mankind prepared to learn exactly how much their father loved them. And in that preparation, each began to understand that some questions carried answers too devastating to survive intact. The announcement approached like a condemned date, marking not just the end of comfortable illusions, but the beginning of a new and terrible chapter in the history of humanity's greatest family. Truth was coming, absolute and unforgiving, and with it the destruction of everything they had believed about love, loyalty, and the bonds that held demigods together as brothers. The rankings would remake them all, and none would emerge from their revelation unchanged. Chapter 6. The first 5 revealed. The throne room of the Imperial Palace blazed with the light of 10,000 lumens, its vast expanse capable of holding entire armies, yet somehow feeling cramped when filled with the presence of 17 Primarchs. The Master of Mankind sat upon the golden throne in silence that pressed against the assembled demigods like the weight of a collapsing star. Each gene-forged son bore the marks of their individual campaigns. Dawn's armor, bearing fresh scars from Sebastus IV, Russ still carrying the scent of Fenrisian ice, Magnus's crimson skin bearing the subtle glow of recent psychic exertion. Yet for all their individual magnificence, they stood united in shared apprehension of what was to come. The Emperor's golden eyes swept across his assembled children with an expression that mixed infinite love with inevitable tragedy. The artifact's compulsion had grown stronger with each passing hour, its psychic tendrils now so deeply embedded in his consciousness that resistance had become impossible. The barriers between thought and speech had eroded beyond repair, leaving him no choice but to speak truths that would shatter the bonds holding his family together. The rankings burned in his mind like brands of molten metal, each name carrying the weight of divine judgment and paternal failure. "My sons," he began, his voice carrying the thunderous authority that had brought 1,000 worlds to compliance. Yet beneath that power lay an undertone of anguish that made several Primarchs shift uncomfortably. "You have demanded honesty regarding my feelings toward each of you. The compulsion that drives this revelation leaves me no choice but to provide the ranking you have requested." Horus stepped forward, his position as War Master giving him precedence even in this most personal of gatherings. The first-found son's noble features showed a mixture of regret and protective instinct, as if he might somehow shield his brothers from what was to come. "Father, perhaps we spoke in haste. The bonds between us have always been." "The bonds between us are built upon necessary illusions," the Emperor interrupted, his voice carrying the inexorable weight of psychic compulsion. "Illusions that have served their purpose but can no longer be maintained. You will hear the truth, complete and unvarnished, regardless of its consequences." The assembled Primarchs fell silent, understanding that their Gene Father had moved beyond the reach of persuasion or appeal. Whatever force drove this revelation operated according to principles that transcended family loyalty or strategic wisdom. The rankings would be spoken, and with them would come the destruction of everything they had believed about love, preference, and paternal affection. "I will begin with those who hold the lowest positions in my heart," the Emperor declared, each word falling like a hammer blow upon the throne room's perfect acoustics. "Not because they lack worth, but because the cruel mathematics of love demand hierarchy, even where none should exist." The silence that followed was absolute. 17 demigods holding their breath as they awaited verdicts that would reshape the foundations of their existence. Some had convinced themselves that they could accept any ranking with dignity. Others had prepared elaborate rationalizations for potential disappointment. None were truly ready for the systematic destruction of their most fundamental assumptions about their father's love. "18th in my affections," the Emperor spoke with voice heavy as a funeral dirge, "stands Angron of the 12th Legion." The words struck the throne room like psychic lightning, their implications clear to every soul present. Angron himself showed no surprise, his scarred features twisting into something that might have been a smile on a more stable mind. The butcher's nails pulsed in his skull, their neural song rising to crescendo as vindication flooded through his damaged consciousness. He had always known himself to be the least beloved, the most broken of his father's children. "The Gladiator King possesses a soul of nobility that breaks my heart to witness," the Emperor continued, his voice carrying genuine anguish. "Yet the butcher's nails have made him nearly unusable as anything but a weapon of last resort. I love what he could have been, mourn what he has become, and fear what he may yet become if his rage continues uncontrolled." Angron threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing through the throne room like the howl of a dying beast. "Truth at last!" he bellowed, his voice carrying the accumulated bitterness of decades spent as an attack dog. No more pretty words about necessary duties and honored service, just the raw honesty that I am broken goods, useful only for ending until something ends me in return. The other Primarchs stared at their brother in horror, understanding for the first time the depth of pain that had always lurked beneath his manufactured rage. Yet before any could speak words of comfort or protest, the Emperor's voice continued with the inevitability of a falling executioner's blade. 17th in my affections stands Conrad Kurz of the 8th Legion. The Night Haunter's pale features showed no emotion beyond a slight tightening around his dark eyes. He had always embraced his role as humanity's necessary monster, the creature that stalked in shadows to preserve the light that others took for granted. Yet hearing his position confirmed in such stark terms struck deeper than any physical wound could have managed. The Night Haunter serves a function that civilization requires, but cannot acknowledge, the Emperor explained, his voice carrying the weight of strategic necessity. He embodies justice through terror, order through fear. Yet that very darkness creates barriers between us that even paternal love cannot fully bridge. I value his service while mourning what it has cost his soul. Kurz's laughter was softer than Angron's, but infinitely more disturbing, carrying within it the accumulated madness of decades spent inflicting necessary horrors. "How refreshing," he murmured, his voice barely audible, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the vast chamber, to hear acknowledged that I am loved not despite my nature, but because of my utility as a weapon of terror. 16th in my affections, the Emperor continued, each word now carrying the weight of a death sentence, stands Perturabo of the 4th Legion. The Iron Warrior's Primarch went rigid, his scarred features reflecting shock that cut deeper than any siege warfare had ever managed. Perturabo had expected disappointment, had prepared himself for confirmation of perceived neglect, yet hearing his position, stated with such mathematical precision, proved more devastating than he had imagined. The bitter vindication he had sought transformed into ashes in his mouth. The Lord of Iron possesses brilliance that could reshape the galaxy, the Emperor said, his voice carrying genuine regret. Yet his bitterness at being assigned siege warfare rather than glory campaigns has consumed him. He interprets utilization as evidence of diminished affection, creating resentment that damages both his effectiveness and our relationship. I value his strength while mourning his growing distance from joy. Perturabo's hands clenched into fists that could have shattered ceramite, his body trembling with the effort of containing emotions that threatened to tear his sanity apart. Utilization, he repeated, his voice carrying the accumulated weight of every thankless campaign, every grinding siege that had claimed thousands of his sons. You speak of utilization as if it were honor rather than burden. 15th in my affections, the Emperor pressed on, unable to stop the revelation, even as he watched it destroy his children, one by one, stands Lorgar of the 17th Legion. The word-bearer's perfect features went ashen, his golden skin losing its radiance as the implications struck home. Lorgar had spent decades crafting the perfect city of Monarchia as a monument to his Gene Father's divinity, only to watch it burn beneath imperial guns as punishment for his emperor worship. Yet even that devastating humiliation paled beside the knowledge that his religious devotion had earned him such a low position in his father's heart. The bearer of the word possesses faith that could move mountains, the Emperor said, his voice now openly sorrowful. Yet his insistence on worshipping me as a god rather than understanding me as a man creates barriers that prevent genuine connection. The destruction of Monarchia was necessary to prevent the spread of religious thinking that would doom humanity to eventual destruction. Yet I fear the lesson was learned too late and at too great a cost. Lorgar fell to his knees, his perfect composure cracking like flawed ceramite under pressure. Tears streamed down his golden cheeks as decades of careful theological construction collapsed beneath the weight of paternal rejection. I sought only to honor you, he whispered, his voice barely audible, to give humanity something greater than mere survival. 14th in my affections, the Emperor concluded this devastating opening salvo, stands Mortarion of the 14th Legion. The Death Lord's pale features showed no surprise, only the grim satisfaction of one who had always known himself to be unloved. Mortarion had never sought his Gene-Father's approval in the manner of his brothers, had never crafted elaborate justifications for his methods or philosophies. He served the Imperium because it was necessary, not because he expected gratitude or affection in return. The Death Lord embodies endurance in its purest form, the Emperor said, his voice heavy with the weight of strategic appreciation, shadowed by emotional distance. Yet his rejection of my intervention on Barbarous, his stubborn insistence on independence, even within imperial hierarchy, creates barriers that prevent deeper connection. I respect his strength, while regretting his distance from warmth and fellowship. Mortarion simply nodded, his weathered features showing neither surprise nor disappointment. "Truth serves better than comfortable lies," he said quietly, his voice carrying the resigned acceptance of one who had never expected love to ease the burden of duty. The throne room had fallen into a silence, deeper than the void between stars. 17 demigods processing revelations that would reshape every assumption upon which their existence had been built. The lowest rankings had been announced, and with them had come the systematic destruction of illusions that had held the imperial family together for decades. Those who had been named stared at their Gene-Father with expressions ranging from bitter vindication to crushing devastation. Those who remained unranked found themselves torn between relief at escaping the initial condemnation and growing dread about where they might fall in the hierarchy to come. Brotherhood bonds that had survived the crucible of galactic conquest were cracking beneath the weight of mathematical honesty about paternal affection. The Emperor gazed upon his assembled sons with eyes that held the accumulated sorrow of 10,000 years, understanding that each word spoken brought them closer to irrevocable fracture. Yet the compulsion drove him onward, demanding complete revelation regardless of consequence. The rankings had begun, and already the damage was beyond repair. 13 more positions remained to be announced, 13 more opportunities to shatter hearts and destroy the bonds that had held demigods together as brothers. The truth was being revealed, and truth, as always, was proving more destructive than any weapon in humanity's arsenal. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, ancient systems registered psychic disruptions that threatened the very foundations of imperial unity. The family of gods was tearing itself apart, one honest word at a time. Chapter 7. The Middle Sons. The silence that followed the announcement of the 5 lowest positions stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. In the vast expanse of the throne room, 17 Primarchs stood paralyzed between horror at what they had witnessed and dread of what was yet to come. Those who had been named struggled with emotions that ranged from bitter vindication to crushing devastation, while their unranked brothers found themselves calculating terrible possibilities about their own positions in the hierarchy of paternal affection. Sanguinius stepped forward, his perfect features etched with anguish that seemed almost blasphemous on one so beautiful. The angel's voice carried a desperate edge as he spoke words that seemed to tear from his throat. "Father, please. Can you not see what this is doing to us? The bonds that have held us together for decades are..." "The bonds were built upon lies," the Emperor interrupted, his voice carrying the inexorable weight of psychic compulsion. "Necessary lies, perhaps, but lies nonetheless. You demanded truth, and truth you shall receive, regardless of its consequences." The artifact's influence pressed against his consciousness like acid against armor, dissolving the last barriers between private thought and spoken word. He could feel the next set of rankings burning in his mind like brands of molten metal, each name carrying the weight of divine judgment that would shatter another piece of the family he had spent centuries building. Yet the compulsion left him no choice but to continue the systematic destruction of everything he held dear. 13th in my affections, the Emperor declared, his voice echoing through the throne room with the finality of a death sentence, stands Corax of the 19th Legion. The Raven Lord's pale features showed no surprise, only the quiet resignation of one who had always understood himself to be peripheral to the great works of empire. Corax had never sought the spotlight that illuminated his more ambitious brothers, had never demanded recognition for victories achieved through stealth and precision rather than glorious conquest. Yet hearing his position confirmed in such stark mathematical terms struck deeper than he had expected. The Deliverer embodies liberation in its purest form, the Emperor explained, his voice heavy with regret. His dedication to freeing the oppressed serves as a moral compass for the entire crusade. Yet his solitary nature, his preference for shadows over brotherhood, creates barriers that prevent deeper emotional connection. I respect his principles, while mourning the distance they create between us. Corax nodded slowly, his dark eyes reflecting acceptance, shadowed by profound sadness. I have always walked alone, he said quietly, his voice barely disturbing the throne room's oppressive silence. Perhaps that isolation was always destined to extend even to family bonds. 12th in my affections, the Emperor continued, unable to stop the revelation even as he watched it destroy another son's sense of belonging, stands Ferrus Manus of the 10th Legion. The Gorgon's metallic features went rigid, his silver hands clenching into fists that could have shattered ceramite. Ferrus had always prided himself on the perfection of his works, the flawless condemned that made his legion's equipment the envy of all others. Yet that same pursuit of mechanical excellence had perhaps cost him something more valuable than any weapon could provide, the warmth of genuine emotional connection with his gene father. The Gorgon represents the pinnacle of technical achievement, the Emperor said, his voice carrying genuine admiration shadowed by paternal sorrow. His pursuit of perfection in all things serves as an inspiration to the Mechanicum and his brother legions alike. Yet that same focus on flawless condemned creates emotional distance. He loves the idea of perfection more than the messy reality of family bonds, and that philosophical distance limits our connection. Ferrus Manus turned his silver gaze toward Fulgrim, seeking some sign of support from the brother who had always understood his pursuit of excellence. Yet the Phoenix remained silent, his own perfect features reflecting the growing horror of realizing that even competence and achievement might not guarantee high position in their father's heart. 11th in my affections, the Emperor pressed onward, each word now a weapon turned against his own family, stands Jagatai Khan of the 5th Legion. The Khan's weathered features showed neither surprise nor disappointment, only the calm acceptance of a soul that had always valued freedom over security. The White Scar's Primarch had never sought to bind himself too closely to imperial orthodoxy, had always insisted on serving the crusade according to his own cultural values and tactical preferences. Yet hearing that independence quantified as emotional distance carried an unexpected sting. The Warhawk embodies the joy of freedom and the beauty of speed, the Emperor said, his voice carrying genuine affection tempered by strategic frustration. His cultural independence and tactical flexibility serve the crusade magnificently. Yet that same freedom creates philosophical barriers between us. He serves my cause while remaining fundamentally his own man, and such independence admirable though it may be, limits the depth of connection possible between father and son. The Khan's response came with characteristic directness. The hawk that soars too high finds the air thin, he said simply, his voice carrying the wisdom of steppes that had shaped his soul. Perhaps distance was always the price of freedom, even freedom to love on one's own terms. "10th in my affections," the Emperor declared, his voice now carrying a note of particular complexity, "stand the twin souls who command the 20th Legion." A murmur of confusion rippled through the assembled Primarchs, for officially the Alpha Legion was commanded by a single Primarch known as Alpharius. Yet the Emperor's phrasing suggested knowledge deeper than public records indicated, awareness of secrets that even most of his sons did not share. The implications were staggering. If there were indeed 2 Primarchs sharing command of the 20th Legion, what other secrets might be hidden within the imperial hierarchy? The Hydra's heads serve imperial objectives with ruthless efficiency, the Emperor continued, his voice carrying the weight of strategic appreciation, shadowed by emotional frustration. Their methods of intelligence gathering and infiltration remain unmatched throughout the crusade. Yet their dedication to secrecy creates barriers that even I struggle to penetrate. They are loyal to the cause, but whether they are loyal to me personally remains deliberately obscured. Such operational security, necessary though it may be, prevents the genuine intimacy that family bonds require. No response came from the Alpha Legion's representatives, their silence as revealing as any words could have been. The mystery that surrounded their methods extended even to their emotional connections, making them valuable assets but distant sons. "9th in my affections," the Emperor continued with voice heavy as a falling mountain, "stands Leman Russ of the 6th Legion." The Wolf King's fanged features twisted in an expression of genuine shock, his fierce pride warring with confusion at finding himself ranked so relatively low. Russ had always considered himself among the Emperor's most trusted sons, the one called upon to execute the most difficult and distasteful commands. Yet that very utility seemed to have cost him something more precious than strategic value, a deeper place in his Gene father's heart. The Wolf King embodies loyalty in its most absolute form, the Emperor explained, his voice carrying genuine affection mixed with strategic regret. His willingness to serve as my executioner, to bear the burden of necessary harshness that his brothers cannot shoulder, makes him invaluable to imperial governance. Yet that same blunt instrument quality limits the deeper emotional connection between us. I rely upon his strength while sometimes forgetting that he possesses a soul capable of more than just faithful violence. Russ snarled low in his throat, the sound carrying decades of unexamined assumptions about his place in the imperial hierarchy. "You made me your attack dog," he growled, his voice carrying the accumulated weight of every distasteful command he had condemned without question. "Yet now you tell me that loyalty costs more than it earns." "8th in my affections," the Emperor concluded this devastating middle section, "stands Lion L. Johnson of the 1st Legion." The Lion's noble features went pale, his proud bearing wavering for the first time in memory as the implications struck home. The 1st Legion's Primarch had always taken pride in his historical precedents, had always assumed that being the prototype granted him special status in their father's estimation. Yet the ranking revealed that chronological priority meant less than emotional accessibility in the cruel mathematics of paternal affection. "The Lion represents everything I hoped to achieve in my first attempt at creating a gene-forged son," the Emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of scientific pride shadowed by emotional disappointment. His tactical brilliance and absolute dedication to imperial ideals serve as examples to all who follow. Yet his suspicious nature, his tendency to second-guess the motives of others, even within his own family, creates barriers that prevent genuine intimacy. I created him to be perfect, but perfection without trust is merely magnificent isolation. The lion's jaw tightened as decades of careful emotional control threatened to crack beneath the weight of such devastating honesty. He had always maintained distance from his brothers as a matter of strategic wisdom, but to learn that such caution had cost him his father's deepest affection was a blow that struck deeper than any enemy's blade. The throne room had become a charnel house of shattered assumptions and broken dreams. 10 Primarchs had been ranked, and each revelation had carved away another piece of the bonds that had held the imperial family together. Those who had been named struggled with emotions that ranged from resigned acceptance to barely contained rage, while their unranked brothers began to understand that even competence and loyalty might not guarantee high position in the hierarchy to come. The middle rankings had proven that being average in their father's affections felt like rejection to beings crafted to be exceptional in all things. Each Primarch had spent decades assuming their position was secure, their place in the Emperor's heart guaranteed by service and sacrifice. Yet the mathematical precision of the ranking system was stripping away such comfortable assumptions, one devastating revelation at a time. Gilliman found his analytical mind racing to comprehend patterns that defied logical explanation. Competence seemed insufficient, loyalty was apparently not enough, and even historical precedents carried less weight than emotional accessibility. If such capable sons could rank so relatively low, what hope did any of them have of truly securing their father's deepest affections? The Emperor gazed upon his assembled children with eyes that held the accumulated sorrow of watching dreams die in real time. 8 more positions remained to be announced, 8 more opportunities to shatter hearts and destroy illusions. Yet the compulsion drove him onward with inexorable force, demanding complete honesty regardless of the devastation it wrought. The ranking continued, and with each revelation, the bonds holding demigods together as brothers grew weaker. Truth was proving more destructive than any weapon, more devastating than any enemy the Imperium had ever faced. The family was tearing itself apart, one honest word at a time, and there was no power in the galaxy that could stop the systematic destruction of everything love had built. Chapter 8. The Beloved Sons. The throne room had become a cathedral of shattered dreams, its golden walls bearing witness to the systematic destruction of bonds that had taken centuries to forge. 10 Primarchs had been named, 10 positions in the hierarchy of paternal love revealed with mathematical precision that carved deeper wounds than any enemy blade could manage. Those who remained unranked found themselves caught between desperate hope and growing certainty that even elevation above their brothers would come tainted with guilt and anguish. Malcador the Sigillite stepped closer to the golden throne, his ancient features bearing the weight of 10 millennia's worth of accumulated sorrow. The regent could feel psychic disturbances radiating from the assembled Primarchs, like heat from a forge, their emotional turmoil threatening to manifest in ways that could tear the palace itself apart. Yet when he opened his mouth to speak words of intervention, the Emperor's golden gaze silenced him with the terrible weight of absolute compulsion. The artifact's influence cannot be contained through mere discipline, the Emperor said, his voice carrying the exhausted resignation of one who had spent days fighting an unwinnable battle. The truth will emerge, regardless of our preferences. Better to control the manner of revelation than allow it to burst forth in uncontrolled fury. The custodians had begun moving into defensive positions around the throne room's perimeter, their auramite armor gleaming with reflected light from the overhead lumens. These perfect guardians could sense the approaching storm as clearly as any weather prophet, could feel the electrical tension building between demigods whose emotional control was rapidly deteriorating. Some of the lower-ranked Primarchs had begun exhibiting signs of barely contained rage, their superhuman restraint the only thing preventing immediate violence. "Seventh in my affections," the Emperor declared, his voice cutting through the throne room's oppressive atmosphere like a blade through silk, "stands Fulgrim of the 3rd Legion." The Phoenix Primarch's perfect features showed a complex mixture of validation and growing unease as the implications struck home. Fulgrim had always known himself to be exceptional among exceptional beings, his pursuit of aesthetic and tactical perfection serving as inspiration to legions throughout the crusade. Yet even securing a position in the upper tier of his father's affections could not entirely offset the knowledge that 6 of his brothers held higher places in the hierarchy of love. The Phoenix embodies the pursuit of perfection in all its forms, the Emperor explained, his voice carrying genuine admiration shadowed by paternal concern. His dedication to excellence serves as an example to all who would elevate themselves above mediocrity. Yet I fear that his growing vanity, his increasing focus on personal achievement over collective purpose, may lead him down paths that compromise the very ideals he seeks to embody. I love his ambition while fearing its ultimate destination. Fulgrim's response came with the measured cadence of one accustomed to diplomatic precision, yet beneath the polished words lay currents of confusion and wounded pride. "To strive for perfection has always been my greatest joy," he said carefully. That such dedication should inspire concern rather than unqualified approval suggests complexities in our relationship that I had not previously understood. From the throne room's shadows, Perturabo's bitter laughter echoed like the sound of grinding metal, his scarred features twisted in an expression of vindicated resentment. "Now the favored son begins to understand what the rest of us have always known," he snarled, his voice carrying decades of accumulated grievances. "That even love comes with conditions and qualifications that no amount of service can fully satisfy. 6th in my affections," the Emperor continued, his voice growing warmer as he spoke of a son whose nature had always brought him genuine comfort, "stands Vulcan of the 18th Legion." The Salamander's Primarch showed no surprise at his position, only the quiet satisfaction of one whose deepest nature had been recognized and validated. Vulcan had never sought glory or conquest for their own sake, had never measured his worth against his brother's achievements, or demanded recognition for victories won through compassion rather than force. Yet hearing his empathy quantified as genuine love rather than mere strategic utility carried profound significance. "The Lord of Drakes represents everything noble in humanity's character," the Emperor said, his voice carrying unfeigned warmth that had been absent from earlier rankings. His compassion for ordinary humans, his dedication to craftsmanship that serves rather than glorifies, his willingness to bear any burden if it protects the innocent. These qualities earn genuine paternal affection rather than mere strategic appreciation. Among all my sons, he alone seems incapable of cruelty for its own sake. Vulcan's response carried the gentle strength that had always marked his character, yet even his words could not entirely mask the growing horror he felt at watching his family tear itself apart. "Love should unite rather than divide," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying across the throne room like distant thunder. Yet this ranking system seems designed to create hierarchy, where brotherhood should flourish. The observation struck home with devastating accuracy, yet the Emperor found himself unable to halt the revelation, even as he watched it destroy everything he held most dear. The artifact's compulsion drove him onward with inexorable force, demanding complete honesty, regardless of the carnage it created among those he loved most in the galaxy. "Fifth in my affections," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute trust earned through decades of unwavering service, "stands Rogel Dawn of the 7th Legion." The Imperial Fist's Primarch received the news with stoic calm that betrayed nothing of the complex emotions stirring beneath his fortress mind's defenses. Dawn had always understood his role as guardian and protector, had never questioned the assignments that kept him close to Terra, while his brothers won glory among distant stars. Yet learning that such dedication had earned him high position in the hierarchy of paternal love carried significance that transcended mere strategic validation. The Praetorian embodies duty in its purest and most essential form, the Emperor explained, his voice carrying the profound relief that came from discussing a son whose loyalty had never wavered despite the burdens placed upon it. His willingness to forego personal glory in service of Terra's defense, his absolute dedication to the protection of what we have built rather than the conquest of what remains unclaimed, creates bonds of trust that approach the sacred. I rely upon his strength not merely as a tool, but as the foundation upon which all other achievements rest. Dawn's response came with characteristic directness, his words carrying the measured weight of one who had always placed duty above personal desire. "To serve as Terra's shield has always been honor enough," he said simply. That such service should earn recognition beyond mere strategic necessity provides satisfaction. Yet even as the Praetorian spoke words of acceptance, the lower-ranked Primarchs had begun manifesting signs of emotional distress that bordered on the dangerous. Angron's scarred features had begun twitching with neural feedback from the butcher's nails, while Kurz's pale hands had started flexing with barely contained predatory instincts. The contrast between those being validated and those who had been rejected was creating fault lines that threatened to tear the assembled brotherhood apart. "Fourth in my affections," the Emperor announced, his voice carrying the profound respect reserved for accomplishments that aligned perfectly with imperial vision, "stands Robout Guilliman of the 13th Legion." The Ultramarine's Primarch received the news with the analytical precision that had always marked his approach to complex problems, yet beneath his composed exterior lay profound satisfaction at having his methods and philosophies validated by the highest possible authority. Guilliman had always believed that practical governance and systematic organization served humanity better than mere conquest, yet securing explicit recognition for such beliefs from his gene father carried significance that transcended personal vindication. The Master of Ultramar represents the synthesis of vision and condemned that defines successful empire, the Emperor explained, his voice carrying admiration for achievements that had transformed entire sectors of the galaxy. His ability to not merely conquer worlds, but to transform them into functional components of greater civilization aligns perfectly with the ultimate goals of the Great Crusade. Among all my sons, he alone seems to truly understand that conquest without integration is merely sophisticated vandalism. Guilliman's response reflected the thoughtful consideration he brought to all strategic challenges, yet even his words carried undertones of growing concern about the ranking's destructive effects. "To build rather than merely destroy has always been my preference," he said carefully. "Yet I find myself troubled by the cost of such recognition when it comes at the expense of brotherhood unity." The observation struck at the heart of the terrible paradox the ranking had created, that love quantified became love diminished, that hierarchy imposed upon equals could only breed resentment and division. Yet the compulsion continued to drive the Emperor forward, demanding complete revelation, regardless of the devastation it wrought upon family bonds that had survived the crucible of galactic conquest. The throne room's atmosphere had grown thick with barely contained violence. The lower-ranked Primarchs' emotional control stretched beyond safe limits. Mortarian's pale features had begun showing the grim satisfaction of one whose cynical expectations were being fulfilled, while Perturabo's bitter rage had started manifesting as slight tremors in his massive frame. Even the higher-ranked Primarchs felt the weight of guilt mixing with validation, understanding that their elevated positions came at the cost of their brothers' anguish. Custodian spears began shifting toward combat positions as the Golden Guardians recognized the approaching crisis. The psychic disturbances radiating from the assembled Primarchs had reached levels that threatened to manifest in physical violence, their superhuman restraint the only barrier preventing immediate bloodshed. The ranking system was proving more destructive than any enemy weapon, more devastating than any external threat the Imperium had ever faced. 4 positions have been revealed in the upper tier, the Emperor said, his voice carrying the terrible weight of knowing that 3 more announcements awaited, the final revelations that would either complete the destruction of his family or somehow provide resolution to the chaos he had unleashed. 3 remain to be named before the hierarchy is complete. The silence that followed was pregnant with approaching storm. 17 demigods balanced on the knife's edge between love and violence, between validation and devastation. The beloved sons had been identified, their positions in the hierarchy of paternal affection confirmed with mathematical precision. Yet even elevation above their brothers had come tainted with the knowledge that some loves were deemed greater than others, that even divine affection could be measured and found wanting. The lower-ranked Primarchs stood rigid with accumulated resentment, while even those elevated to higher positions found their validation tainted by guilt over their brothers' anguish. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne, like a figure carved from living tragedy, his golden eyes reflecting the accumulated sorrow of watching his greatest creation tear itself apart through the simple power of absolute honesty. The artifact's compulsion pressed against his consciousness with inexorable force, demanding completion of the revelation regardless of the carnage it wrought among those he loved most in the galaxy. 3 names remained unspoken, 3 positions that would either complete the destruction or provide some form of resolution to the chaos he had unleashed. Malcador stood frozen beside the throne, his ancient features bearing witness to the approaching catastrophe with the helpless horror of one who could see disaster but lacked the power to prevent it. The custodians had moved into full defensive positions around the chamber's perimeter, their auramite armor gleaming with reflected light as they prepared for violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. The psychic pressure radiating from the assembled Primarchs had reached levels that threatened to manifest in ways that could shatter the palace itself. 3 positions remain, the Emperor declared, his voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a blade through silk. The final revelations that will complete the hierarchy you demanded to hear. Horus stepped forward, his noble features reflecting the confidence that had always marked his bearing as War Master. The first-found son had weathered the rankings thus far with diplomatic grace, secure in the knowledge that his position as Supreme Commander surely reflected his place as most beloved among his gene-father's children. Yet as the final announcements approached, even his formidable composure began showing hairline cracks of uncertainty. 3rd in my affections, the Emperor announced, his voice carrying the profound respect reserved for bonds that transcended normal understanding, stands Magnus, the Red of the 15th Legion. The Crimson King's psychic aura flared with complex emotions that rippled through the throne room's atmosphere like heat waves from a forge. Magnus had always known himself to be different from his brothers, his connection to the Emperor operating through channels that none of the others could access or understand. Yet hearing that unique bond, quantified as the third highest position in their father's heart, carried implications that even his vast intellect struggled to process. The Crimson King shares burdens with me that none of his brothers can comprehend, the Emperor explained, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge. His psychic gifts allow him to perceive the true scope of what we face, the real cost of the path humanity must walk. That understanding creates a connection between us that approaches the sacred, yet it also isolates him from his brothers and threatens to break his mind beneath burdens no single soul should carry. I love him for his strength, while mourning the isolation that strength creates. Magnus's response came through psychic channels rather than spoken words, his consciousness reaching out to touch his gene father's mind with gratitude, shadowed by profound sorrow. The Thousand Sons. Primarch understood better than any of his brothers the terrible price that came with such elevated ranking, that love based on shared burden was both profound connection and crushing isolation. From the chamber's far end, Angrun's bitter laughter echoed like the sound of grinding metal, his scarred features twisting with neural feedback from the butcher's nails. "The Witch King takes third place through his unnatural gifts," he snarled, his voice carrying decades of accumulated rage. How fitting that even love requires supernatural abilities to achieve its highest expressions. "Second in my affections," the Emperor continued, his voice now carrying the profound trust earned through decades of flawless service, stands Horus Lupercal of the 16th Legion. The silence that followed was absolute, 17 Primarchs processing the implications of what they had just heard. Horus himself went rigid with shock, his noble features reflecting confusion that bordered on the absolute. The first found son, the War Master, the one who had always assumed his position as most beloved was unquestionable, relegated to second place by mathematical precision that allowed no appeal or negotiation. The War Master embodies everything I hoped to achieve in a military commander, the Emperor explained, his voice carrying genuine affection tempered by strategic assessment. He was my first son, the proof that my genetic experiments could succeed. His tactical brilliance and natural leadership earned him command over all Imperial forces. Yet that very position has begun to change him, to awaken ambitions that extend beyond service into expectation. I love what he has achieved, while fearing what he may become if pride continues to grow within his heart. Horus staggered, as if struck by a physical blow, his formidable composure cracking beneath the weight of revelation that shattered every assumption he had built about his place in their father's estimation. "The warm first in my affections," the Emperor declared, his voice carrying reverence normally reserved for the sacred, "stands Sanguinius of the 9th Legion." The angel's perfect features showed no triumph, only profound sorrow at the knowledge that his elevation had come at such devastating cost to his brothers. Sanguinius had always understood himself to be beloved, yet hearing that love quantified as supreme above all others carried implications that filled his noble heart with anguish rather than pride. The weight of being declared most loved in a family now torn apart by such revelations felt more like curse than blessing. His voice angered. Other Primarchs moved to intervene or join the violence as emotional control that had held for decades finally snapped under the weight of mathematical honesty about paternal love. Perturabo's bitter rage found outlet in assault upon Fulgrim, his grievances about aesthetic achievement versus practical siegecraft finally given physical expression. The Iron Warriors, Primarchs' scarred fists struck with force that could shatter armor as he vented decades of resentment upon a brother whose perfection had always seemed to mock his own grim functionality. Kurz's predatory instincts awakened completely, the Night Haunter flowing through shadows as he sought targets among brothers whose higher rankings had always inspired his particular brand of jealous hatred. His pale hands moved like weapons as he struck at those elevated above him in their father's affections. Magnus attempted to impose psychic restraints upon the growing violence, his crimson aura flaring as he sought to contain forces that threatened to tear the palace apart. Yet even his considerable powers proved insufficient against the emotional chaos that had been unleashed, the fury of 17 demigods whose bonds of brotherhood had been quantified and found wanting. Gilliman and Dawn moved to establish order through tactical coordination, their strategic minds recognizing that the violence threatened not merely personal injury, but the stability of the entire imperial hierarchy. Yet their efforts at containment were overwhelmed by the sheer scope of the emotional explosion that had been unleashed. The custodians charged forward with spears lowered, their auramite armor blazing as they sought to protect the Emperor from violence that had spiraled beyond control. Yet even their perfect training proved insufficient against demigods, whose superhuman abilities had been unleashed without restraint or limitation. The throne room became a battlefield, where gods fought gods, where family bonds forged in conquest were shattered by the simple power of absolute honesty about love. Brother struck brother with force that could level cities, their accumulated grievances and wounded pride finally given violent expression. The careful emotional architecture that had held the imperial family together for decades collapsed in moments as truth proved more destructive than any weapon in humanity's arsenal. The Emperor sat upon his throne like a figure carved from living anguish, watching his greatest creation destroy itself through the revelation he had been compelled to provide. The rankings had been completed, the hierarchy made manifest with mathematical precision. Yet the cost of such honesty had proven higher than even his vast wisdom could have anticipated. The family of gods was tearing itself apart, and no power in the galaxy seemed capable of stopping the violence that absolute truth had unleashed. Love quantified had become love destroyed. Brotherhood measured had become brotherhood shattered. The trinity of love had been revealed, and with it had died everything that made the Primarchs more than mere weapons in service of conquest. In the depths of the imperial palace, where ancient systems monitored the psychic health of humanity's greatest champions, alarms began screaming warnings that the foundational bonds holding the Imperium together had just been severed beyond repair. Chapter 10. The Shattered Brotherhood. The silence that settled over the throne room carried the weight of empires ending and dreams dying. Where moments before the chamber had echoed with the fury of gods at war, now only the soft hum of damaged machinery and the labored breathing of wounded demigods disturbed the oppressive quiet. The Emperor's golden radiance had dimmed to barely visible emanations as he surveyed the devastation that absolute honesty had wrought upon his greatest creation, a family of beings more powerful than any force in the galaxy, now fractured beyond recognition by the simple mathematics of quantified love. Captain General Constantin Voldor and his custodians moved through the aftermath with practiced efficiency, their auramite armor bearing fresh dents from impacts that could have shattered lesser warriors entirely. The Golden Guardians had finally managed to separate the combatants through a combination of superior numbers and psychic dampening fields, yet their victory felt hollow when measured against the scope of what had been destroyed. Brotherhood bonds that had survived the crucible of galactic conquest lay in ruins, shattered by truths that should never have been spoken aloud. Angron stood at the chamber's far end like a statue carved from barely contained fury, his scarred features bearing fresh wounds that wept blood onto the cracked ceramite floor. The World Eater's Primarch had been among the most difficult to restrain, his assault upon Sanguinius, driven by decades of accumulated resentment, finally given focus and target. Yet now, as the immediate violence subsided, his rage had crystallized into something far more dangerous than mere physical fury, cold determination to prove his worth through the only means he understood. 18th! He spoke the number like a curse, his voice carrying the accumulated bitterness of every thankless campaign and grinding siege. You have made your judgment clear, Father. The broken gladiator ranks lowest among your affections. Very well. I will show you what the least beloved of your sons can accomplish when freed from the burden of seeking approval that was never meant to be given. Without waiting for response or acknowledgement, Angron strode from the throne room with purposeful steps that promised violence on a scale to match his wounded pride. The Emperor watched his most damaged son depart with profound sorrow, understanding that the ranking had confirmed every cynical assumption that had festered in the gladiator's heart. The truth had been meant to heal through honesty, yet instead had poisoned whatever remained of their relationship beyond any hope of recovery. Perturabo lingered longer, his bitter gaze fixed upon the Emperor with an intensity that seemed to burn through the throne room's artificial light. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had always suspected his father's lack of genuine affection, had always sensed the utilitarian calculations that drove his assignments to grinding siege warfare rather than glorious conquest. Yet hearing those suspicions confirmed with mathematical precision had transformed resentment into something approaching hatred. 16th in your affections, he said, with voice that carried the weight of falling mountains. Below even the Witch King and the night-haunting monster. You have taught me a valuable lesson about the nature of love and duty, Father. I will remember it well when next you require my services in breaking what others cannot. Iron is strongest when it accepts that it will never be cherished for its beauty, only valued for its utility. The Lord of Iron departed without ceremony, his scarred features reflecting the grim satisfaction of one whose darkest expectations had been exceeded by reality. Behind him, damaged machinery sparked and smoldered where his rage had found physical outlet during the violence that had consumed the chamber. The Emperor felt another piece of his heart die as he watched a son who could have been magnificent embrace the cold utility that would define the remainder of his existence. From the 17th, he whispered, his voice carrying the accumulated madness of decades spent inflicting necessary horrors. How refreshing to hear acknowledged that I am exactly what you made me to be, a creature of darkness whose only purpose is to inspire terror in service of your grand design. The truth has liberated me from any pretense of seeking something I was never meant to receive. From this moment forward, I embrace what I am without reservation or regret. The Night Haunter melted back into shadow and departed through passages known only to creatures that stalked in darkness, his laughter echoing through corridors that would never again seem entirely safe. The Emperor closed his golden eyes against the knowledge that his 17th son had just abandoned whatever remained of his humanity, embracing monstrosity as the logical response to confirmed unlovability. Father, he said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of one seeking absolution for sins he had never intended to commit. Please let me speak with my brothers. Perhaps if they understood that rankings mean nothing compared to the bonds we have always shared. They will not listen, the Emperor interrupted, his voice heavy with the weight of absolute knowledge. The damage transcends rational thought or noble gesture. Love quantified becomes love diminished. Brotherhood measured becomes brotherhood destroyed. Your position at the apex of my affections now marks you as a reminder of their perceived failures, rather than an inspiration to greatness. The angel's perfect features crumpled with anguish that seemed almost blasphemous on one so beautiful. Then what am I to do? How can I bear being beloved when that very love has destroyed the bonds that made existence meaningful? To be first among brothers who can no longer stand to look upon me feels like the cruelest punishment imaginable. The Emperor had no answer to offer, for the question struck at the heart of the terrible paradox the ranking had created. Truth spoken in love had become destruction wrought through honesty, revelation intended to clarify becoming devastation that poisoned everything it touched. The mathematical precision of emotion had proven more destructive than any weapon in humanity's arsenal. Magnus the Red stood apart from the others, his crimson aura flickering with psychic disturbances that reflected the chaos raging within his enhanced consciousness. The Thousand Sons, Primarch had always understood his father's burdens through empathic connection that transcended normal communication. Yet even his vast mental capacity struggled to process the implications of being ranked third in the hierarchy of divine affection. The position validated his unique relationship with the Emperor, while simultaneously isolating him from brothers who could never share or understand such connection. The truth changes nothing and everything, he said quietly, his words carrying across psychic channels rather than disturbing the air. I am still the same being I was before the ranking, yet the knowledge of my position has fundamentally altered how I must relate to those around me. Brothers who once sought my counsel now see only confirmation of their own inadequacy reflected in my elevated status. The Emperor nodded slowly, understanding that his psychically gifted son grasped the full scope of what had been unleashed more clearly than any of his brothers could manage. Magnus's position in the ranking would serve as constant reminder to lower-placed siblings that even the Emperor's love operated according to hierarchies they could never hope to climb through effort or achievement alone. Horus remained motionless at the chamber's center, his noble features bearing witness to devastation that transcended physical injury. The War Master had spent decades building his identity around being the Emperor's most beloved son, the trusted first found who had earned supreme command through demonstrated worthiness. Yet learning that such achievements placed him only second in their father's affections had shattered assumptions that formed the foundation of his existence. I gave everything, he whispered, his words barely audible, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the vast space. Every campaign, every victory, every moment of service dedicated to proving myself worthy of the trust you placed in me. Yet even perfect condemned of duty earns only second place in your heart. The Emperor rose from the golden throne and approached his most accomplished son with steps that seemed to carry the weight of entire civilizations. When he placed a hand upon Horus's shoulder, the War Master flinched, as if struck by lightning, his body trembling with emotions too complex for simple categorization. You misunderstand the nature of what was revealed, the Emperor said gently, his voice carrying infinite compassion shadowed by profound regret. "The ranking does not diminish your achievements or question your worthiness. It simply acknowledges that love operates according to principles that transcend strategic value or tactical competence. Sanguinius holds the highest position, not because he serves better than you, but because his nature resonates with my own aspirations for humanity in ways that even perfection cannot achieve through effort alone." Yet the explanation fell upon deaf ears, for Horus had moved beyond the reach of rational comfort. The damage went deeper than wounded pride or professional disappointment. It struck at the fundamental assumptions that allowed him to function as both son and supreme commander. The careful balance between personal affection and strategic responsibility had been shattered by mathematical precision that reduced divine love to numbered positions in an equation of preference. Gilliman approached with the measured steps of one seeking to impose order upon chaos through systematic analysis, his analytical mind racing to comprehend patterns that defied logical explanation. The Ultramarines Primarch had always believed that competence and dedication would earn appropriate recognition. Yet the rankings had revealed complexities in their father's emotional life that challenged every assumption about merit and reward. "The consequences extend beyond personal anguish," he observed with characteristic directness. "If word of these rankings reaches the legions themselves, the effects could destabilize the entire command structure of the Great Crusade. How can brothers lead effectively when their relative worth in their gene father's estimation has been quantified with such devastating precision?" The Emperor nodded slowly, understanding that his most practical son had grasped implications that extended far beyond the throne room's immediate devastation. The ranking would not remain secret for long. Wounded Primarchs would carry their anguish back to their legions, and such pain could not be contained within the palace's walls indefinitely. The mathematical hierarchy of love would spread like contagion through the imperial war machine, poisoning relationships and undermining unity at every level of command. Vulcan moved among his wounded brothers with the patient compassion that had always marked his character, offering comfort to those willing to accept it while respecting the space required by others to process their devastation in solitude. The Salamander's Primarch understood better than most that healing such wounds would require time measured in decades rather than moments, if, indeed, such recovery was possible at all. "Love was never meant to be measured," he said, quietly, his deep voice carrying the wisdom earned through years of crafting weapons and mending broken things. "The attempt to quantify what should remain boundless has poisoned the very thing it sought to illuminate. We are less than we were before the truth was spoken, diminished by knowledge that should have remained unspoken." The observation struck at the heart of the terrible paradox that had destroyed everything the Emperor held most dear. Truth in service of love had become destruction wrought through honesty, revelation intended to heal becoming devastation that poisoned everything it touched. The ranking had answered the question demanded by wounded pride, yet the answer had proven more destructive than any lie could have managed. As the immediate aftermath settled into grim acceptance of irreversible damage, the Emperor understood that his greatest creation had just suffered wounds that would never fully heal. The bonds holding his family together had been severed by the simple power of absolute honesty, their love reduced to mathematics that transformed brothers into competitors in equations of preference. The truth had been spoken, complete and unvarnished as demanded. Yet its revelation had proven that some questions carried answers too devastating to survive intact, that some knowledge was too dangerous to be shared even between father and sons who had conquered the galaxy together. In the depths of the imperial palace, ancient systems registered psychic disruptions that threatened the foundational stability of the greatest empire in human history. The family of gods was broken, and with it had died something essential to the dream of unity that had driven the Great Crusade from its inception. Chapter 11. The Price of Honesty. The ripples of devastation spread across the galaxy like shock waves from a dying star, carried by astropathic communiques that bore news too terrible for most mortals to comprehend. Within days of the throne room's catastrophic gathering, every Legion fleet, every forward operating base, every compliance force learned that their Primarchs had been ranked according to the Emperor's love, and that mathematical hierarchy had shattered bonds that had seemed unbreakable since the Great Crusade's inception. The Ultramarines received word of their Gene Father's fourth-place ranking with measured pride that could not entirely mask growing unease about its implications. Across the 500 worlds, Space Marines who had spent decades proving their worth through systematic governance and tactical excellence found themselves elevated in status among their brother legions. Yet the validation carried unexpected weight. Victory celebrations in newly compliant systems took on undertones of superiority that had never existed before, as if Guillemon's high ranking somehow vindicated every strategic decision and political philosophy his sons had embraced. Captain Augustin of the 4th Company found himself struggling with reactions that seemed to violate every principle of brotherhood his training had instilled. "We serve the Emperor's vision equally," he declared during a war council on Calth's orbital stations. "Our Primarch's position in his affections does not diminish the worth of our brother legions or their achievements." Yet even as he spoke the words, Augustin could not entirely suppress the knowledge that Guilliman's ranking reflected genuine recognition of the 13th Legion's systematic excellence. The doubt was insidious, working its way through even the most disciplined minds, like acid through armor. If the Emperor himself had declared their Gene Father superior to 13 of his brothers, did that not suggest fundamental differences in worth that transcended mere tactical preference? In the outer reaches of the Ghoul Stars, the Iron Warriors received news of Perturabo's 16th place ranking, with reactions that ranged from bitter vindication to incandescent rage. Legion serfs reported that entire companies had gathered in silence around voxcasters, their scarred faces reflecting emotions too complex for simple categorization. The ranking confirmed every suspicion of neglect and utilitarian assignment that had festered in their gene seed for decades, yet hearing such treatment quantified with mathematical precision proved more devastating than theoretical grievance ever could. Warsmith Kroger found his hands clenching into fists that could crush ceramite as he addressed his grand battalion from the command deck of the Iron Blood. 16th, he spoke the number like a curse that carried the weight of accumulated centuries. Our Gene Father ranks 16th in the Emperor's affections, below even the Witch King and the night-haunting monster. Yet who breaks the fortresses that others cannot breach? Who reduces the strongholds that protect humanity's enemies? The Emperor's affection may rank us low, but his reliance places us where the fighting is hardest and the glory least. The words carried dark satisfaction, yet beneath the surface lay currents of resentment that would poison every future interaction with higher-ranked brother legions. When combined strike forces were assembled for major operations, the Iron Warriors found themselves noting every assignment, every resource allocation, every gesture that might reflect their diminished status in their Gene Father's estimation. Brotherhood that had survived the crucible of shared warfare began fracturing under the weight of mathematical hierarchy that reduced divine love to numbered positions. The Blood Angels received word of Sanguinius's supreme ranking with joy that lasted precisely until they understood what such elevation had cost their angelic father. Across the breadth of their fleet actions, the 9th Legion's warriors found themselves approached by battle brothers from other legions, with expressions that mixed congratulation and barely concealed resentment. To be declared sons of the most beloved Primarch should have brought honor, yet the knowledge came tainted with guilt over the anguish such revelation had wrought among their Gene-Father's brothers. Captain Azkaelon of the Sanguinary Guard struggled with emotions that had no precedent in his centuries of service, as he received petitioners from multiple legions seeking audience with representatives of the favored bloodline. "Our father's position means nothing if it destroys the bonds that have held us together as brothers," he declared with passionate intensity. "The ranking system reduces love to mathematics and brotherhood to competition in ways that violate everything the Great Crusade represents." Yet for all his noble words, Azkaelon could not entirely suppress the knowledge that Sanguinius truly was the most perfect among the Primarchs, that his elevation reflected genuine recognition of qualities that set him apart from even his magnificent brothers. The doubt was poisonous precisely because it contained elements of truth that could not be dismissed through mere loyalty or diplomatic courtesy. Robert Guilliman had thrown himself into diplomatic missions with the systematic intensity that marked all his endeavors, traveling personally to Legion fleets and compliance worlds to attempt healing rifts that grew wider with each passing day. The Ultramarines Primarch understood better than most that the ranking system threatened not merely family relationships, but the operational effectiveness of the entire Imperial war machine. Yet his efforts at reconciliation were complicated by his own position in the hierarchy. Words of comfort from the 4th most beloved son carried undertones of superiority that poisoned even well-intentioned gestures. His meeting with Lionel Johnson aboard the Dark Angel's flagship Invincible Reason had lasted 3 days and achieved nothing beyond mutual frustration. The 1st Legion's Primarch received every diplomatic overture with suspicion that bordered on paranoia, his noble features reflecting assumptions that Guilliman's mission served hidden purposes rather than genuine concern for brotherhood unity. "You speak of healing," the Lion had observed with characteristic directness, "yet your very presence here carries reminder of your elevated status in our father's estimation. How can there be genuine reconciliation between brothers when mathematical hierarchy has been imposed upon relationships that should transcend such measurements?" The question struck at the heart of the terrible paradox the ranking had created, that even attempts at healing carried implicit acknowledgement of the wounds that needed treatment. Guilliman departed the meeting with profound understanding that some damage transcended diplomatic solution, that truth spoken in love had become devastation that would reshape the foundations of Imperial unity. Vulcan had attempted a different approach, organizing gatherings on neutral worlds where Primarchs might meet without the formal structure that reinforced their ranked positions. The Salamander's Primarch understood that healing would require genuine connection rather than diplomatic protocol, yet his efforts met with responses that reflected the deep psychological wounds the ranking had inflicted upon his brothers' souls. The assembly on Nocturne had attracted only 6 Primarchs, and even those who attended struggled with interactions that had once been natural as breathing. Ferrus Manus spent the entire gathering in brooding silence, his metallic features reflecting the knowledge that his 12th place ranking had somehow quantified his father's disappointment with mechanical precision. Corax participated in discussions with quiet resignation that spoke of acceptance shadowed by profound sorrow. Even Fulgrim, elevated to 7th place, seemed unable to enjoy validation that had come at such devastating cost to family unity. "We were brothers before the ranking," Vulcan had declared during the gathering's final hours. We remain brothers after it, regardless of numbered positions in equations of love. Our bonds transcend mathematical hierarchy because they were forged in shared purpose rather than competitive affection. Yet the words rang hollow, even as he spoke them, for everyone present understood that knowledge, once gained, could not be unknowable. They were no longer simply brothers. They were brothers ranked according to their father's love, and that hierarchy would color every interaction for the remainder of their existence. The lower-ranked Primarchs had begun manifesting behavioral changes that reflected their newly understood positions in ways that threatened operational effectiveness throughout the galaxy. Perturabo's assignment protocols had grown increasingly rigid, his acceptance of siege warfare missions carrying undertones of resentment that affected tactical decision-making. When offered support from higher-ranked legions, the Iron Warrior's Primarch declined, with formal courtesy that could not entirely mask his bitter assumption that such offers reflected pity rather than genuine strategic cooperation. Angron's modifications to World Eater's doctrine proved even more concerning, as the already brutal Legion embraced methods that pushed beyond acceptable limits into realms that approached the psychotic. Reports reached Terror of compliance actions that left worlds technically conquered, but so devastated that their productive capacity had been essentially destroyed. The Emperor's attempts to counsel moderation through astropathic communication were rejected, with responses that grew increasingly incoherent as the Butcher's nails interacted with psychological wounds that would never heal. The Great Crusade itself had begun showing signs of systemic dysfunction as the ranking system's effects spread through command structures that had operated according to principles of brotherhood and shared purpose. Joint operations between legions required careful consideration of ranked relationships, with higher-positioned Primarchs receiving deference that complicated tactical coordination. Resource allocation decisions that had once been made according to strategic necessity now carried implications about relative worth that poisoned even routine administrative functions. The Emperor's personal attempts to explain the ranking's complexity were met with responses that reflected how deeply the mathematical hierarchy had wounded his son's capacity for trust. His astropathic communications, emphasizing that love operates according to principles transcending strategic value, were received with skepticism by Primarchs who had learned that even divine affection could be measured and found wanting. Private meetings with individual sons achieved little beyond confirmation that the damage extended far beyond wounded pride into realms that challenged fundamental assumptions about family, duty, and worth. When Horus finally agreed to audience, after weeks of careful negotiation, the War Master's demeanor reflected psychological trauma that seemed to have fundamentally altered his relationship with command authority itself. The second most beloved son struggled with questions that struck at the heart of his identity as both family member and supreme military commander. If perfect condemned of duty earned only secondary status in their father's affections, what meaning could strategic achievement possibly carry beyond mere utilitarian function? I gave everything in service of proving myself worthy of your trust, Horus had declared, with voice that carried exhaustion deeper than any physical fatigue. Yet even such dedication places me only second in your heart. The ranking has revealed that love operates according to principles I cannot understand or influence through effort. How then can I continue to serve as War Master when the foundation of my authority has been revealed as fundamentally conditional? The question remained unanswered, because no answer could address the core issue. That truth about paternal love had proven more destructive than any deception could have managed. The ranking system had been demanded by wounded pride and delivered with inexorable honesty. Yet its revelation had poisoned the very relationships it sought to clarify through mathematical precision. Across the galaxy, the Great Crusade continued its advance through sectors that had never heard of the ranking system. Yet even those distant operations felt the effects as Legion cooperation deteriorated, and command relationships became complicated by hierarchies that reduced Brotherhood to numbered positions. The Emperor's greatest achievement, a family of demigods united in purpose despite their individual differences, had been shattered by the simple power of absolute honesty about love. The price of truth had proven higher than any payment the Imperium could afford, yet the damage was irreversible. Love quantified had become love destroyed. Brotherhood measured had become brotherhood fractured beyond repair. The mathematical hierarchy of divine affection had achieved what no enemy force had ever managed: the systematic destruction of unity among humanity's greatest champions. In the depths of space, where Imperial fleets continued their advance toward distant stars, the ranking system spread like contagion through warriors who had once considered themselves equals in service to a greater cause. The Great Crusade would continue, but it would never again be the unified force that had once seemed capable of bringing order to the entire galaxy through bonds of brotherhood that transcended all other considerations. Chapter 12. Love's Eternal Wound. 3 weeks had passed since the throne room's devastation, when the Emperor finally gathered sufficient psychic strength to shatter the artifact's hold upon his consciousness. The effort required channeling power that could have ignited stars, focusing 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom into a single moment of absolute will that carved the alien compulsion from his mind like a tumor excised by surgical flame. The ancient relic cracked and crumbled to dust beneath the assault, its malevolent influence dispersing into the warp's chaotic currents, where it could no longer poison the thoughts of gods. Yet the victory felt hollow as cosmic dust, for the damage had moved beyond the reach of even divine intervention. Truth once spoken could not be unspoken. Knowledge once gained could not be made unknown. The mathematical hierarchy of love had been branded into the consciousness of 18 demigods with precision that would outlast the heat death of stars, creating wounds that would fester throughout the remainder of their existence. The Emperor stood alone in his private chambers, surrounded by the ashes of the artifact that had compelled such devastating honesty, and understood that he had traded temporary compulsion for eternal anguish. The attempts at reconciliation had proceeded with all the careful choreography of a funeral, formal gestures that acknowledged loss while offering no hope of resurrection. Sanguinius had thrown himself into diplomatic missions with desperate intensity, visiting brother after brother in attempts to heal rifts that seemed to widen with each well-intentioned word. Yet even the angel's perfect nature could not overcome the fundamental problem that his very presence served as reminder of his supreme position in their father's affections, making every gesture of brotherhood carry undertones of superiority that poisoned even the most sincere overtures. His meeting with Angron aboard the Conqueror had lasted precisely 17 minutes before the World Eater's Primarchs' control snapped completely, the Butcher's nails screaming their neural song as manufactured rage overwhelmed whatever remained of diplomatic restraint. "You come to me wearing your crown of perfect love," Angron had snarled through fierce foam, offering comfort to the 18th ranked son, as if your pity could heal wounds that go deeper than flesh. Keep your sympathy, Angel. I have learned to embrace what I am rather than mourn what I can never become. The savage dismissal had broken something fundamental in Sanguinius's noble heart, confirming his growing understanding that love quantified had become love weaponized. To be first among brothers when brotherhood itself had been destroyed felt less like blessing than curse. A golden chain that bound him to isolation among those who had once called him family without reservation. Other attempts at healing had met with responses that reflected the diverse ways in which psychological wounds could manifest among beings crafted to be beyond mortal limitation. Perturabo had received Vulcan's overtures with formal courtesy that could not entirely mask the bitter calculations now driving his every interaction with higher-ranked brothers. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had begun treating family relationships as siege problems requiring systematic reduction rather than emotional connections worthy of preservation and nurture. Brotherhood is a luxury for those whose worth has never been questioned, Perturabo had declared during their stilted conversation aboard the Iron Blood. The ranking has taught me that even divine love operates according to principles of utility and strategic value. I will remember this lesson when next called upon to break what others cannot, to bear burdens that bring no glory, but serve essential functions. Mathematics has clarified what diplomacy obscured, that we are tools first and sons second, regardless of the comfortable illusions that once suggested otherwise. The lion had retreated into suspicious isolation that made his previous emotional distance seem warm by comparison, his noble features bearing the weight of assumptions about hidden motives and concealed agendas that poisoned every interaction with family members. Being ranked 8th, despite his historical precedence, as the First Legion had awakened paranoid instincts that transformed ordinary conversations into potential threats requiring careful analysis and defensive response. Yet perhaps most disturbing were the changes in those Primarchs who had embraced their rankings with satisfaction rather than resentment. Fulgrim's 7th-place position had validated his pursuit of aesthetic perfection, while simultaneously awakening vanity that bordered on the pathological. His every achievement now measured against the 6 brothers deemed superior in their father's estimation. The competitive edge that had once driven healthy excellence had metastasized into something approaching obsession with surpassing those ranked above him through demonstrations of increasingly elaborate perfection. The Emperor had withdrawn to the deepest chambers beneath the palace, spaces where even the custodian's vigilance could not penetrate, to wrestle with questions that challenged the foundations of his ancient wisdom. In the silence of vaults that had witnessed the birth of gods, he confronted the terrible paradox of love applied to beings created to serve strategic functions within a grand design that spanned millennia. The ranking had revealed the impossibility of separating emotional attachment from utilitarian calculation when the objects of affection were simultaneously children and weapons in humanity's desperate struggle for survival. Love as pure emotion exists only in the realm of mortal limitation, he admitted to the empty darkness, his voice carrying the weight of insights that brought no comfort. When extended lifespans allow relationship to span centuries, when the beloved possess power to reshape the galaxy itself, love becomes inevitably entangled with strategic consideration and functional assessment. The ranking revealed not merely my feelings, but the fundamental impossibility of being both father and emperor to beings whose nature transcends the categories that define normal family bonds. The realization carried profound implications for the remainder of his eternal existence. How could he continue to function as both paternal figure and supreme strategist when every decision about his sons would now be filtered through the mathematical hierarchy that had been burned into their consciousness? Every assignment, every responsibility, every gesture of trust would be interpreted through the lens of ranked affection rather than strategic necessity, poisoning the careful balance that had allowed family bonds to coexist with imperial duty. New protocols had been established with systematic thoroughness that reflected hard-learned wisdom about the dangers of absolute honesty in family relationships. Psychic wards of unprecedented complexity now guarded against external compulsions that might strip away the careful emotional barriers necessary for effective governance of superhuman children. Archives containing detailed psychological profiles of each Primarch were sealed behind security measures that exceeded those protecting the most sensitive strategic intelligence, ensuring that such devastating knowledge could never again be weaponized against the bonds holding his family together. Yet the protocols felt like elaborate measures to prevent disasters that had already occurred, defenses against threats that had already achieved their purpose. The ranking would remain a hidden shame within imperial records, referenced only in classified documents that bore security classifications beyond even the highest levels of military clearance. Officially, the gathering had never occurred, the rankings had never been spoken, the wounds had never been inflicted. Yet everyone who mattered understood that silence about the event served convenience rather than healing, concealment rather than resolution. In quiet moments, when administrative duties allowed reflection, the Emperor found his thoughts drifting toward implications that extended far beyond immediate family dynamics. The ranking had revealed fault lines within his most trusted circle that enemies might exploit, psychological vulnerabilities that could be leveraged by forces seeking to undermine imperial unity from within. A Primarch convinced of his unworthiness might prove susceptible to influences promising alternative sources of validation. A son desperate to improve his position in paternal affections might take risks that served ambition rather than strategic wisdom. The seeds of future catastrophe had been planted in soil prepared by wounded pride and mathematical hierarchy, yet predicting exactly how such influences might manifest proved beyond even his vast foresight. Would Horus's devastation at being ranked only second, despite his War Master status, create vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit? Would Angron's embrace of his lowest position drive him toward nihilistic violence that transcended even his current brutality? Would Perturabo's bitter acceptance of utilitarian status make him susceptible to forces offering recognition for his often overlooked contributions to imperial success? The questions haunted his ancient consciousness because they carried no clear answers, only the terrible knowledge that wounds inflicted by honesty often proved more lasting than those created by deception. He had raised his sons to value truth above comfort, yet the ranking had demonstrated that some truths carried power to destroy the very things they sought to illuminate. Love examined too closely had withered beneath analytical scrutiny. Brotherhood measured too precisely had fragmented into competitive hierarchy. As Terra's sun set behind the palace's golden spires, casting long shadows across chambers that had witnessed the birth and death of dreams spanning millennia, the Emperor contemplated the fundamental question that would define the remainder of his relationship with his gene-forged children. Had the ranking revealed truth about his feelings, or had it created new truth through its expression? Did love exist as fixed quality waiting to be discovered, or did it emerge through the process of definition and measurement itself? The artifact had compelled honesty, yet perhaps honesty about emotion was itself a form of creative act rather than passive revelation. In forcing him to quantify feelings that had never required mathematical expression, the compulsion might have fundamentally altered the nature of those feelings rather than simply exposing their pre-existing character. Love transformed through analysis became different from love experienced through intuition, just as light examined too closely revealed its particle nature while losing its wave-like mystery. Yet such philosophical speculation offered little comfort when measured against the practical reality of 18 wounded sons whose psychological scars would influence every decision for the remainder of their existence. The damage was irreversible, regardless of its ontological status. The family bonds had been fractured beyond repair, irrespective of whether the fracturing revealed inherent weaknesses or created new ones through the process of examination itself. In the depths of the imperial palace, where ancient machinery hummed with the power to support a civilization spanning millions of worlds, the emperor understood that he had learned the most expensive lesson in the history of conscious thought, that some questions, once answered, destroyed the very relationships that made the answers meaningful. Love quantified had become love diminished. Honesty weaponized had become honesty destructive. The Great Crusade would continue. The Imperium would expand across the galaxy. The dream of human unity would advance through conquest and compliance. Yet the family of gods who served as the dream's primary instruments had been fundamentally altered by mathematical precision applied to matters that thrived only in the realm of unexamined assumption and comfortable ambiguity. They remained his sons, but they would never again be simply his children. They were now his children, ranked according to preference, measured according to love, positioned according to affection, in ways that would color every interaction until the stars themselves burned cold. The ranking had achieved what no enemy force had ever managed, the systematic transformation of unconditional family bonds into conditional hierarchies of preference. Truth had proven more destructive than any lie, honesty more devastating than any deception. Love's eternal wound had been opened, and time would prove whether it might eventually heal or would fester until it consumed everything touched by its influence. In the silence of chambers built to house immortal sorrows, the Emperor closed his eyes and accepted the burden that would define the remainder of his existence. Being father to demigods who would never again wonder whether they were loved, but would always know exactly how much.